The longship groaned against the ice-edged dock at the edge of the world. Michelstrom stood at its prow with snow settling in her dark hair and a letter tucked against her ribs, her family's tribute to a king they feared and a task they had handed to the one daughter they could afford to lose. The harbor of Nordvik stretched before her, all stone and gray sea and mountains that scraped the underside of the clouds. It was the most desolate place she had ever seen. And yet, for reasons she could not yet name, it was also the first place she had ever arrived where she did not immediately feel the need to make herself smaller. She was wrong about that last part, of course. Someone was looking. On the ridge above the harbor, barely visible through the snow haze and the curtain of falling white, a single figure on horseback sat perfectly still. Dark cloak.
Impossible stillness.
The kind of presence you feel before you see it, a pressure in the air, a weight in the atmosphere, as though the land itself recognized the man and adjusted accordingly. He was not watching the harbor in the way of a man waiting for news. He was watching her in the way of a man who had already reached a conclusion and was simply confirming it. Michelle pulled her cloak tighter and looked away. She had a letter to deliver. She had nothing else to offer. She was the plain one, the dispensable one, the temporary placeholder for a family too proud to send anyone they actually valued, and she had spent the entire voyage north reminding herself of this fact, so that she would not arrive with the dangerous habit of hoping. She did not know yet that she was already being watched by the one man who would refuse, absolutely and irrevocably, to let her disappear. Quick pause, comment where you're watching from, and if you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. I've got a lot more coming. Chapter 1. The Letter and the King. She had rehearsed it on the ship. The words of presentation, the precise angle of her bow, the tone she would use, formal but not obsequious, respectful but not frightened. She had learned enough of the northern tongue from the texts in her father's library that she could deliver the greeting in his language if required, though her accent would betray her immediately, and she had no illusions about that. She had stood at the prow of the longship practicing diction against the wind, the spray of black seawater stinging her cheeks, telling herself that the only thing that mattered was executing the task correctly and returning home without incident. The great hall of Nordvik Keep was nothing like she had expected. She had prepared herself for the theatrical barbarism her stepmother had described. The bones hanging from rafters, the fire pits and animal hides, the rough ceremony of people who did not yet know what civilization looked like. What she walked into instead was a hall of carved granite and dark timber, tall as a cathedral and as cold as one, lit by a dozen iron chandeliers whose candles threw light across tapestries that told stories she could spend years learning to read. The floor was smooth stone, swept clean. There were books on a shelf beside the eastern wall, not decorative, but clearly used, their spines cracked with the evidence of actual reading. She had approximately 3 seconds to take all of this in before her escort announced her, and then Aslak Christensen, king of the northern reaches, alpha of the 5 clans, rose from the chair at the head of the hall's long table, and every rehearsed word she had prepared drained out of her head completely. He was not what she had expected either. She had expected someone larger, somehow, more theatrical. The man in the stories her family told was all scale and fury, a figure who had ended 3 blood feuds in a single winter, who had held a mountain pass against 200 men with 40 of his own, whose name alone was enough to quiet halls and reroute trade routes. The man standing before her was large, yes, broad through the shoulders, carrying himself with the particular stillness of someone who has never needed to prove they are the most dangerous person in the room. But what struck her first was not his size. It was his face. Scar above the jaw, deep-set eyes the color of the fjord in winter, a quality of attention so complete and so focused that she understood immediately why people found him unsettling. He was not performing authority. He simply had it, the way mountains have weight. She delivered the letter. She spoke the greeting in the northern tongue, watching his expression shift almost imperceptibly. Not surprise, exactly, but something recalibrating, when her accent proved less catastrophic than expected. She stood straight and still while he broke the seal, and read. She kept her breathing even. She thought about the horizon line, the trick she had learned as a child for keeping her face neutral during her stepmother's assessments. Find something fixed, something that cannot be affected by what is happening in the room, and breathe toward it. She watched him read. She could not see the letter's face, but she could see his, and what she saw was a man exercising extraordinary control over his expression while something moved behind his eyes, something she might have called anger, except that it was colder than anger, more deliberate. He read it twice. Then he set it down with the precise, careful movement of a man ensuring he does not do something irreversible with his hands. The silence stretched. Michelle waited. Then he looked at her, not at her general direction, not at the space she occupied, but at her, with a directness so complete it felt like a question, and he asked, "Did your family tell you what this letter contains?" She had not expected that. She had expected protocol. Pleasantries, perhaps. Formal acknowledgement, a courteous dismissal to guest quarters while the Northern Court decided what to do with her. Not this. Not the direct, unhurried attention of a man who had just read something that clearly required a response and had instead decided to look at her first. "No," she said. He studied her face, as though looking for the lie. He did not find one because there was none to find. She genuinely did not know what the letter said. She had been handed it sealed, told it contained words of goodwill and tribute, told to deliver it and represent the family with whatever dignity she could manage. She had done exactly that. He did not show her the letter. He folded it, set it aside, and was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. Then something shifted in his expression, not softening, exactly, but a decision being made, visible only in the slight change of his focus, the way a man looks when he has revised his course of action and is now executing the new one. "You will be housed in the Eastern Wing," he said, "the warmest quarters in the keep." She had been prepared to be housed in the servants' block. She had prepared herself for this, had built herself a story about how it was simply practical and not personal, how it did not mean what it looked like. She had not prepared for the Eastern Wing, the warmest quarters. The gesture was small enough to seem like nothing. She felt it like a thunderclap. "Thank you," she said. Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that. He nodded once, called for an escort, and returned to something on his table. A map, she thought, or a report, and she was led out of the hall by a woman warrior whose expression suggested she had seen many emissaries enter this hall, and very few of them managed to leave it with the particular composure this one had managed. Michelle walked through the stone corridor toward the Eastern Wing and did not let herself think about the look on his face when he had finished reading the letter. She did not let herself wonder what had been in it. She did not let herself notice that the thing she felt, walking through those gray and firelit halls, was not the dread she had arrived with. She noticed it anyway. Chapter 2. The Keep and the Cold. She spent the first 3 days mapping exits. It was a habit she had developed young, the way some children collect stones or press flowers. Michelle Strom, by the age of 10, had learned to locate every door and window and unguarded corridor in any space she occupied, because a house where you are not fully welcome is a house you should always know how to leave quickly. The Eastern Wing of Nordvik Keep presented a new challenge to this habit. It was comfortable, warm, stone-walled, hung with tapestries that blocked the drafts, furnished with a writing table and a bed piled with pelts so thick they constituted a landscape of their own. The fire was laid every evening before she returned from the communal dinner. The water was warm. There were, on the third morning, fresh flowers and a clay vase, a thing so improbable in this frozen northern coast that she stood looking at them for an unreasonable amount of time, trying to understand who had gone to the trouble and why. The guards outside her door were unfailingly polite. They were also, she quickly understood, entirely immovable. When she had asked on the second evening whether she might walk down to the harbor, her ostensible reason was to check on the longship. Her actual reason was to confirm that she still had access to it. The warrior on duty had smiled with genuine regret and explained that the harbor district was not safe after dark for an unescorted southerner unfamiliar with the territory. He had offered to arrange a morning escort. She had accepted. He had escorted her, efficiently and pleasantly, to every part of the harbor she needed to see, and she had returned to the Eastern Wing understanding with absolute clarity that she was very comfortable and very much a captive. On the fourth day, she met Sigrid. The king's second-in-command arrived at her door without announcement at the mid-morning hour, when Michelle was sitting at the writing table attempting a letter home that managed the difficult task of saying nothing worrying while conveying that she was alive and functioning. Sigrid was tall, iron-haired, with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades outdoors and the posture of someone who had never in her life felt the need to make herself smaller in a room. She looked at Michelle with the frank, measuring assessment of a person who had learned that surfaces were lies and had stopped consulting them. "You are not eating enough at dinner," she said, by way of greeting. Michelle blinked. "I eat sufficiently." "You eat the amount a woman eats when she is trying to take up as little space as possible. This is the North. We will need you conscious and functional." She set down a covered plate on the writing table, bread, hard cheese, something smoked that smelled extraordinary.
"Eat."
"I will sit." She sat. Michelle, somewhat stunned by the sheer directness of it, ate. Sigrid talked while she did. Not gossip, not small talk, but information. The names of the jarls and which ones mattered, and which ones were ceremonial. The protocols of the morning gathering and which violations would cause actual offense versus which were simply frowned upon and forgiven. The history of the Eastern Wing. It was the king's own old rooms, she mentioned, entirely in passing, as though this fact did not mean anything, and the names of the household staff, and who could help her with what. Michelle stopped eating. These were his rooms? Sigrid met her eyes. He moved to the northern tower when he became king. He has not used the Eastern Wing in 11 years. A pause. Until now. The silence between them held something large and unspoken. Michelle picked up her bread and continued eating, because the alternative was to sit with the implication of that statement, and she was not ready for that. What she learned from Sigrid over the following days, in pieces, in careful increments, as though the woman was measuring how much truth Michelle could carry at a time, was this: the letter her family had sent was not a diplomatic message. It was a transaction. Her stepmother, with the particular creativity of someone who had always viewed Michelle as a resource rather than a person, had written to the northern king describing her stepdaughter as a trained domestic, quiet, capable, no political attachments, useful for household administration in a large court. She had listed her in the same paragraph as the tribute goods. She had suggested a value in silver. She had sent Michelle north not as an emissary, not even technically as a person. She had sent her as a gift. Michelle sat with this for a long time, looking at the flowers in the clay vase, still fresh, replaced this morning, and she did something she had not done since she was 14 years old and had understood for the first time that her father's silence on the subject of her treatment was permanent.
She cried.
Not dramatically, not for long. She had never had the luxury of dramatic weeping, but in the way of someone finally feeling a wound that had been numb for years. It hurt with a clean, specific precision. She let it. Then she stood up, washed her face with the warm water in the basin, and went to find the library. If she was going to be in Nordvik Keep for the foreseeable future, against her will, in a situation that was more complicated than she had any tools to navigate, she was going to need better tools. The library seemed like a reasonable place to start. She did not yet know that someone had noticed the light under the library door at midnight and had turned back from his usual route and stood very still outside for a long moment before choosing, with great deliberateness, to walk inside. Chapter 3. The first real conversation. The library was cold. Not bitter cold. The fireplace was lit, and the room was small enough that the heat held, but cold the way northern spaces always were, a cold that lived in the stone itself and seeped out slowly no matter how many fires you set, a cold that was not hostile so much as indifferent. Michelle had pulled a chair directly in front of the grate and wrapped herself in the wolf fur throw she had found folded on one of the lower shelves, and she was reading a history of the western settlements in the old language, working through it the way she worked through most difficult things, slowly, without rushing herself, stopping when she needed to think and continuing when thinking was done. She heard the door. She did not look up. She had been the subject of too many assessments in her life to flinch from the sound of them now, and she had learned long ago that looking up first gave the other person information she had not chosen to give. The footsteps were quiet. They stopped some distance behind her, which told her whoever it was had chosen not to come closer without invitation, a courtesy she had not expected from anyone in this keep but Sigrid. She finished the sentence she was reading, an account of a navigational crossing that had been badly miscalculated, the ship's commander misreading the star patterns and ending up 3 days off course, and set her finger at the passage. Then she looked. He was standing in the middle of the room with an expression she had not yet seen on his face, not the controlled formality of the great hall, not the deliberate assessment of their first meeting, but something quieter than either. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something unexpected that has turned out to be exactly right, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "You read the old language," he said. It was not a question. Barely. She turned the book so he could see the page. "Enough to know your histories, make ours look modest." Something that might have been amusement moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, but the structural precondition for one. He came the rest of the way into the room and sat in the other chair, the one on the far side of the grate, close enough that the firelight reached them both. He did not ask permission. He did not perform any ceremony about it. He sat the way a man sits in a space where he intends to stay, and she noted that he did not check for her reaction to this, which meant he was either very arrogant or very certain she would not object. She did not object. "What are you reading?" he asked. "The account of Commander Halvor's Western Crossing. The one in 847. The failed navigation." He misread the Daughters of the Sky. He misread the Daughters of the Sky because he was working from a map with an error in it, she said. The error was introduced 2 generations earlier by a cartographer who had never actually made the crossing himself and was transcribing from a secondary source. The navigator trusted the map over his own observation. That's not a failure of navigation. That's a failure of epistemology. A pause. Then, where did you learn that? Your library. 3 days ago. She looked at him steadily. The primary cartographer's notes are in the lower shelf, east wall. He documents the error himself. He knew the discrepancy was there, but was working on commission for a lord who did not want the route changed. He recorded his concerns in a private notation that was apparently never read by anyone who mattered. He was looking at her with an expression she could not fully read, not the flat control of public performance, but something more open than that, something she was not practiced enough in his face to name yet. He stood, went to the east wall, crouched to the lower shelf, and returned with a slim, dark-covered volume she recognized as the one she had been examining the previous afternoon. He read the passage, she meant. His expression shifted in small increments, recognition, then something she might have called respect, then something else that was neither of those. "My best cartographers certified a route last winter," he said, still looking at the page. "I have had concerns about it that I could not articulate precisely." "Which route?" He told her. She asked 3 questions. He answered them. She thought for a moment, then told him what the problem was, not with dramatic flourish, not with the performed modesty of someone hoping to impress, but in the straightforward way of someone who has simply worked something out and is sharing the workings. He listened without interrupting, which she had learned was not a courtesy men of power typically extended, and when she finished he was quiet for a long time. "How did you learn cartography?" he asked. "My father's library. There was nothing else to do." A pause. "I read what was there." "And what was there?" "History, cartography, trade accounts, rune texts. I couldn't read those for years, but I kept trying." She looked at the fire. No one was using the library. It was the only room in the house where no one looked for me. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. Not the careful space of 2 people negotiating territory, but something warmer, more honest. He set the cartographer's notebook on the table between them and leaned back in his chair, and she watched him in the firelight and thought that he looked, just then, less like a king and more like a man, a tired man, perhaps, who had been performing a role for a very long time and had not expected to find, in the unlikely form of an overlooked southern woman in his library at midnight, someone whose company required nothing performed at all. They talked for 2 hours, about the old wars and their real causes, which were never what the official histories claimed, about the naming traditions of the North and what it meant to carry a name that belonged to someone else's ambition, about the history of the Cartographers Guild and why institutional knowledge was almost always less reliable than first-hand observation. She told him things she had never told anyone, not because she was trying to reveal herself, but because he asked questions that assumed she had things worth saying, and the novelty of being assumed toward rather than away from was enough to open doors she had kept closed for years. He told her things too, not personal things, not yet, but small, precise observations about the keep and its people, the kind of things a leader notices and rarely gets to say aloud, because the people around them are always listening for the political meaning rather than the human one. She listened without looking for subtext. He seemed to notice. When she finally looked up and saw that the candles had burned down considerably, she realized it was well past midnight and she had no memory of deciding to stay. "I should sleep," she said. "Yes." He did not move immediately. He looked at her for a moment in the dying firelight, and the look was the same one from the great hall. Direct, complete, the attention of a man who is not performing interest but actually experiencing it. "You should bring that cartographer's text to me tomorrow. My navigators need to see it."
"I can do that," she said.
She walked back to the eastern wing in the dark and the cold, and she told herself, with great firmness, that it had been nothing. A conversation. An exchange of information. She was useful, that was all. She was occasionally useful, and useful people were kept until they were no longer needed and then released, and that was the only dynamic at play here, and she would do well to remember it. She lay awake for a long time. Chapter 4. The cloak on the doorstep. She found it the next morning, folded on the stone outside her door. There was no note, no explanation, no message tucked into the folds, no indication of provenance beyond the thing itself. Heavy wolf fur, deep charcoal gray, lined with something dense and warm that she did not immediately recognize and which turned out, on closer examination, to be the inner fleece of a breed of mountain sheep that she had read about in the northern husbandry texts, but never encountered in practice. It was, without question, the warmest garment she had ever touched. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and something sharper, pine resin, she thought, or cold stone. The kind of smell a place carries when you have lived in it long enough. She stood with it in her hands for a considerable amount of time. It was not a servant's gift. She had spoken with enough of the household staff to understand what they could and could not afford, what they gave and what they received. It was not from Sigrid, who expressed care through directness and food rather than objects. It was exactly the right size, which required either a very accurate guess or a specific instruction. The fur was the best quality she had seen in the keep, reserved for the upper jarls and the king's own household. She put it on. She stood in the corridor of the eastern wing feeling the weight of it settle around her shoulders like a hand, and she thought, with the practiced efficiency of someone who has spent 23 years managing inconvenient feelings, that she would simply not think about it. It was a cloak. It was warm. She was cold. These were the relevant facts. She wore it to the morning gathering and watched Sigrid's expression do something that was not quite a smile, but was definitely adjacent to one. "New cloak," Sigrid said, with the tone of a woman making an observation that was not actually about the cloak. "It was outside my door this morning." "Was it?" No note. Sigrid was quiet for a moment. "He does not give gifts," she said finally. "Since Alara died, he has not given anything personal to anyone. He brought trade goods to alliances and gave strategic support to his jarls and made the expected gestures at the expected times. But not gifts." A pause. "Not like this." The name hit Michelle somewhere she had not expected, not with jealousy, which would have been a cleaner feeling, but with something more complicated. The knowledge of a grief she had not witnessed, a loss she had no right to have feelings about, the sudden awareness that the careful distance in his face was not simply a king's professional reserve, but a man's earned caution, the specific wariness of someone who has understood that attachment has a price and paid it. "Tell me about her," Michelle said. Sigrid looked at her with the measuring expression she used when deciding how much truth a person could carry. She seemed to conclude that Michelle could carry a reasonable amount. "Brilliant," she said. "Sharp and quick and fearless in a way that made the Jarls nervous and made him." She paused, choosing words carefully. "She made him laugh." That was the thing people remember most. That she made him laugh easily, often, in ways he did not guard against. She died in the fever winter, 3 years after they married, and he became another pause. He became what he needed to become. A king without edges that could be reached. Michelle looked at the fire and thought about edges and the things that removed them and the things that, apparently, brought them back. "I am not her," she said quietly. "No," Sigrid agreed. "You are something else entirely. That may be exactly the point." She wore the cloak every morning after that. She told herself it was practical, and it was practical. The winds off the fjord were genuinely brutal, and the keep's interior was only marginally warmer than the outside, but she knew that practicality was not the only reason. She knew the weight of it, the specific warmth of it, the quality of attention it represented. She wore it because it was the first thing anyone had given her without wanting something back, without pricing it, without attaching conditions to the warmth. She wore it, and she did not let herself want anything further, because wanting further was how you got hurt, and she had been hurt with sufficient frequency to have developed a reasonably healthy respect for the practice of self-protection. She wore it, and she did not think about the way he had looked at her in the library. She did not think about the 2 hours of conversation or the particular quality of his attention. She did not think about the fact that he had sent for the cartographer's notes the morning after their conversation and spent 3 hours with his navigators, and that Sigrid had reported, with studied casualness, that the rerouted path had been accepted unanimously. She thought about all of it, constantly, and she was furious at herself for it, and she wore the cloak. Chapter 5. The Jarls Begin to Watch. Word moved fast in a small court. She had not quite understood, in her first week, how completely she was being observed, not just by the household staff, who were unfailingly professional about it, but by the Jarls and their attendants, the senior warriors, the merchants who traded at the keep's weekly market, the women who managed the domestic logistics of a fortress that housed several hundred people. She was a southerner in the North's most significant seat of power, arriving without clear status, carrying a letter whose contents were apparently interesting enough to produce an unusual response from a king not known for unusual responses. She was interesting. She was data. And in a court where power was the constant, primary currency, data about what the king found interesting was extraordinarily valuable. The cloak had clarified the data considerably. She noticed it in the quality of the attention at the morning gatherings, a shift from the polite indifference afforded to a temporary visitor of uncertain purpose towards something more calibrated. The Jarls looked at her now in the way of people who have reassessed a situation and are not yet certain what conclusion to reach. Most of them were waiting. Several were clearly calculating. 1 or 2 had moved to a posture that looked, cautiously, like preliminary respect. And then there was Gunnar. Jarl Gunnar Ulfsson was the second most powerful man in the 5 clans by territory and the most powerful by personality. A large, loud, thoroughly political man of about 60 who had outlasted 3 previous kings and had the particular confidence of someone who understood that longevity in a volatile court was itself a form of excellence. He had been watching her since the second day, and not with hostility, with the patient assessment of a chess player examining a piece of unknown value that has appeared on the board without clear provenance. He caught her alone in the eastern corridor on the 8th morning, stepping into her path with the cheerful directness of a man who had decided subtlety was unnecessary. "You are not what was described in the letter," he said. She met his gaze without flinching, because flinching with men like this was a form of permission.
"No."
"What were you described as?" She considered several answers. Diplomatic ones, deflective ones, the kind of careful non-response that her stepmother had trained her to deliver in precisely these situations, the answer that gave nothing away and cost nothing and meant nothing. She thought about those answers. Then she thought about the library at midnight and the navigator's error and the cloak outside the door. She thought about what it felt like to be spoken to as though what she said was worth hearing. "Something expendable," she said.
Gunnar stared at her.
His expression went through several distinct phases: surprise, reassessment, a quality of attention that was different from what had come before. Then he laughed. It was loud and startled and genuine, the laugh of a man who has been in courts long enough that genuine surprise is a rare commodity, and he did not try to swallow it or modulate it or make it more appropriate. He simply laughed. "By the gods," he said. "You're serious." "Entirely." He studied her for another long moment, head tilted slightly, the expression of a man revising a document he had thought was finished. "What do you know about the Eastern trade agreements?" "Which year?" "Last winter's. The wool tariffs." She told him what she knew, which was quite a lot, as it turned out, because the trade accounts had been part of what she'd read in the keep's library, and she had a retentive memory for numbers and a particular interest in the structural logic of trade agreements, which she had always thought were really just applied arguments about power expressed in a vocabulary that made them seem neutral. She told him where the tariff structure created incentives that actually worked against the stated goals. She told him what she would have changed and why. He listened with the full, unguarded attention of someone hearing something unexpectedly correct. "You should have been sent here years ago," he said when she finished. "I was sent here to be disposed of." Yes, he said, with the tone of a man acknowledging both a fact and a very significant error. I can see that. He crossed his arms and looked at her with something she was not practiced enough in northern expressions to name precisely, but which felt, unmistakably, like the opening stages of genuine respect. Your family is going to regret that decision considerably. They're going to regret it because they underestimated you. Or, he paused, something shifting in his face, because the king has already decided something, and they don't yet know what it is. She said nothing. She could feel the weight of the cloak around her shoulders and the cold of the corridor and the particular quality of being in a place where the calculations were shifting around her faster than she could track them all. Do not be afraid of him, Gunnar said, and his voice had lost the sparring quality and become something more direct, more quiet. He is difficult, and he is private, and he has not been reachable in a very long time. But he is not a man who disposes of things. A pause. He is a man who holds what matters to him with both hands. He nodded once, not a bow, exactly, but something in that register, and walked away down the corridor, leaving Michelle standing with the warmth of the cloak around her and the weight of everything Gunnar had and had not said pressing against her ribs like a second heartbeat. For the first time since she had arrived in the north, she let herself consider the possibility that she might not be leaving. Chapter 6. The Storm and the Truth. The storm came in the night. She heard it before she felt it, a change in the quality of the wind outside her window, a deepening note in the sound the keep made when the cold moved through it, a shift from the ordinary winter sounds of snow and wind to something larger and more committed. By the time she woke fully the morning after, Nordvik Keep was under 3 feet of fresh snow and the storm was still coming, and the harbor master had already sent word that no ship would be leaving or arriving for at least 3 days. 3 days. No protocols to retreat behind. No formal ceremonies to give shape to the hours and keep the unspoken things at a manageable distance. She ate breakfast alone and told herself this was fine. By mid-morning, she was in the library again, where else she had no other refuge, and by late morning he was there too, for the second time, with snow on his cloak and the distracted look of a man who has finished the things that can be done in a blizzard and finds himself at an unusual loose end. She looked up when he entered. He looked at her with the particular expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that suggested he had not entirely decided to come here and was confronting the evidence of his own decision with mild surprise. She did not make it easy for him or difficult. She simply made space. They talked about the storm first, practical matters, the reserves, the structural vulnerabilities of the outer wall that had been identified last winter and were still only partially addressed. He was a man who talked about logistics the way other people talked about politics, with the focused attention of someone who found that the real work of keeping a thing alive was always more interesting than the theoretical version of it. She had opinions on several of the structural questions, and she offered them, and he listened with the kind of attention that took the opinions seriously rather than humoring them. And then somewhere in the second hour, the fire was lower, the wind was louder. The room had taken on the particular intimate quality of a space where the outside world has been locked out. The conversation changed direction. She did not track the moment precisely. She remembered speaking about the way a building's weaknesses were always present from the original design, flaws that looked fine under ordinary conditions and only became visible under stress. He had been quiet for a moment, and then he said, very quietly, that the same was true of people. Yes, she said. He was looking at the fire. The role I carry. It is made of the decisions of men who came before me, some of whom made those decisions well, and some of whom made them very badly, and I inherited all of it, the structural flaws included. I have spent 15 years doing what could be done within the frame I was given. And what could not be done within it?
He was quiet for a long time.
Much, he said finally. Then, less than I thought in some areas. More than I was willing to acknowledge in others. She waited. Your family's letter, he said. I read it 3 times before I decided what to do. He paused. What decided me was not the insult in it, and there was significant insult in it, disguised in diplomatic language, but clear enough. What decided me was a single line. She looked at him. Which line? He was quiet. The fire shifted. Outside, the storm pressed against the stones of the keep with a low, sustained sound like the breathing of something enormous. They described your silence as your only virtue, he said. And I thought, What kind of people would call a woman's silence her best quality and then wonder why she never speaks? The words hit her somewhere she had not expected and did not immediately know what to do with. She felt her breath change. Not dramatically. She did not let it show dramatically, but she felt the quality of it alter, the way the air in a room alters when a window is opened. They named it precisely, she said. And then, because the fire was low and the storm was outside, and this was the third time she had been in this room with this man who looked at her as though what she thought was worth knowing, she said, I was 10 when I understood that my father's silence on the subject of how I was treated was not going to change. I was 12 when I understood that speaking was not a tool I was allowed. Not because anyone said so directly, no one ever said so directly, but because every time I spoke there was a recalibration in the room, a collective readjustment, a quality of attention that suggested my speaking was a minor inconvenience everyone was too polite to acknowledge. So I stopped speaking freely. I became very good at saying exactly what was required, and nothing further. And the only place I was entirely myself was in that library with the books, because books do not readjust when you have opinions. She stopped. She had not planned to say any of that. She had not said any of that, ever, to anyone. He was looking at her with an expression she finally had a name for. It was not pity, and it was not sympathy, and it was not the careful performance of concern that people offered when they wanted to seem moved without actually being moved. It was grief, a specific, personal grief, the grief of a man who recognized a kind of damage because he understood the shape of it from the inside. Tell me what you think, he said quietly. About anything, whatever is in your mind right now, without editing. A beat. Then she did. She told him what she actually thought about the Eastern trade agreements and the flaw in the structural logic of the Fourth Jarl's governance territory and the navigational routes and the history she had been reading and 3 ideas she had had about the keep's food storage systems that had been sitting in the back of her mind because she had nowhere to put them.
She talked for a long time.
He did not interrupt. He did not perform listening. He actually listened, with the focused, generous attention of a man who had decided that what she was saying mattered, and was making room for all of it. When she finished, the fire had burned almost to coals. The storm was still loud outside the windows. The room felt very small and very complete. That, he said, is what they called your silence a virtue for concealing. She looked at him across the dying firelight and felt the last of something she had been holding tightly for 23 years begin, slowly and irrevocably, to loosen. Chapter 7. The Message from the South. The letter arrived 11 days after the storm cleared. She did not know it had arrived for 3 days after that because no one told her. What she noticed was that a slack became unavailable, not cold, not distant in the way of a man withdrawing from something, but distant in the way of a man doing something complicated in private, the particular quality of absence that belongs to someone who has withdrawn to manage a problem rather than to escape a person. She had learned his rhythms well enough by then to distinguish between the two. She told herself not to notice. She noticed. She read. She spent time with Sigrid, who was teaching her, without ever explicitly naming it as teaching, the protocols of the Northern Councils and the complex genealogy of the 5 clans, and the things you needed to know to navigate the dynamics of a court that ran on honor and long memory and the kind of grudges that lasted generations. She helped Gunnar with a calculation he was working through for the spring trade routes, sat at his table for an entire afternoon and worked through the numbers with him, and at the end of it he looked at her with the expression he had been developing steadily over the past week, the expression of a man watching a long-held assumption dissolve. You should have been an advisor, he said. I was not given the education for it. You were not given the title for it, he corrected. You educated yourself regardless. That is generally considered the harder path and the better credential. On the 3rd day of Aslak's unusual absence, Sigrid came to her door at mid-morning and handed her a folded piece of vellum, without preamble. Read it, Sigrid said. Michelle read it. The letter was from her stepmother, written in the elegant, careful hand of a woman who had learned to weaponize courtesy. It was addressed to the king of the northern reaches. It was, from its first line to its last, a masterwork of elegant devastation, the kind of damage that did not announce itself as damage, but arrived wearing the costume of concern. Her stepmother expressed, with great delicacy and evident pain, that Michelle had always been prone to inappropriate attachments and a tendency toward imaginative elaboration of situations that had not occurred as she described them. She was, her stepmother wrote, a troubled girl, Not unkind, not malicious, simply unwell in certain ways, in certain situations, and they had always monitored her carefully for exactly these tendencies. The family was deeply concerned for the king's grace's reputation. They were embarrassed that his hospitality had been imposed upon by a family member whose behavior they had always struggled to manage. They would collect her within the fortnight, and they were prepared, if his grace found it acceptable, to send a more suitable representative, her elder sister, Astrid, accomplished and beautiful and properly trained in the nuances of northern diplomacy. Astrid would be a credit to both families. Michelle would be brought home and managed appropriately. Michelle sat with the letter in her hands and read it twice. She had known, in the abstract way you know the things you have always known and have simply managed not to look at directly, that her family viewed her this way. She had known it from the door that was not fully closed, from the dry efficiency of her stepmother's voice, saying send Michelle the way you might say send the old horse, from 10,000 small recalibrations and collective readjustments and strategic silences. She had known it. She had just never seen it written down in someone else's hand and directed at someone at the king she. She stopped that thought before it finished. She put the letter down on the table and sat with it and breathed. She thought about what it meant that he had not told her. She thought about what it meant that he had been distant for 3 days, doing something complicated in private. She thought about what Sigrid had said. He is a man who holds what matters to him with both hands. She picked up the letter again and read the line about sending Astrid. She put it back down. She stood up, straightened her cloak, the wolf fur, the charcoal gray, the warmth she had been wearing every morning for 11 days, and she walked to the door of the eastern wing and stopped there with her hand on the frame. For 23 years she had accommodated other people's stories about her. She had lived inside the frame they built and moved within its dimensions and told herself this was practical, this was safe, this was the cost of surviving in a household that had decided she was the dispensable one. She had been so thoroughly trained to accept the version of herself that others constructed that she had spent 2 decades barely noticing that she was doing it. She noticed now. She turned back from the door and sat down again. Not because she was retreating. Because she was deciding deliberately, consciously, with full awareness of what she was choosing, that she was not going to do this the way her family expected her to do it, the way she had always done difficult things, quietly and alone, and without making trouble. This time, she was going to make trouble. Chapter 8. The confrontation she did not plan. She did not wait for an invitation. She did not stop to consider whether this was wise. She did not draft what she planned to say, did not rehearse the words, did not think about the angle of her approach or the tone she would use or the precise diplomatic framing that would make this easier for everyone involved. She had spent 23 years doing all of those things and they had not served her, and she was done with them. The war room was on the 2nd level of the main keep, past 2 separate guard stations that she had now walked past enough times that the warriors there recognized her and stepped aside without challenge. The door was not closed. It was never fully closed, a practical concession to the reality that in a working fortress the people responsible for decisions needed to be interruptible, and she could hear his voice before she reached it, low and precise, going through supply numbers with a kind of focus that did not invite distraction. She walked in. The 3 Jarls went quiet and still with the abruptness of men who have just encountered something they did not expect. He looked up from the map, and for one fractured second, barely long enough to notice, short enough to deny, she saw it, surprise, and something behind it that was not surprise at all, something that had been waiting. "I have read the letter," she said. He held her gaze for a beat. Then, without looking at them, he dismissed the Jarls with a single precise gesture. They filed out with the efficiency of men who understood perfectly well what had just changed the temperature of the room and who had the good judgment not to comment on it. The door closed. The room settled into the particular silence of 2 people with something large between them. She did not give him time to construct a careful response, because a careful response would be kind and structured and managed, and she did not want managed kindness right now. She wanted the truth. "Everything in that letter is false," she said. Not exaggerated, not biased, not the product of a family's legitimate concerns about a difficult daughter. False. Constructed, deliberately and precisely, to discredit me before you could decide for yourself what to believe. She held his gaze. "I need you to tell me whether you believe it." He did not look away. He did not perform consideration. She had learned enough of his face by now to tell the difference between a man actually deciding something and a man enacting the performance of deciding. And this was the real thing. This was an irrevocable door being opened or closed. The silence lasted long enough to count.
No, he said.
I do not believe it, she exhaled. I had it investigated, he continued, with the quiet directness of a man reporting a decision he had already made. I sent a writer south 3 days ago. There is nothing to find because there is nothing to have found. No reports of the behavior described, no family physician who has ever treated you for instability, no record of anything your stepmother implies.
A pause.
The letter is a very well-constructed fabrication. Your stepmother is extremely skilled.
She always has been, Michelle said.
He nodded. And then something changed in his expression, the management of it, the careful control he maintained in every professional interaction, shifted. Not disappeared, but became something different. More open. More personal. I am more concerned, he said quietly, with what your family plans to do when they arrive and find that I have no intention of returning you. The room went very still. She looked at him. This man who was all scar and silence, and the specific, hard-earned warmth of someone who had survived grief and kept going, who had spent 10 years being correct and utterly alone, and was apparently, improbably, done with being correct. She looked at him, and she felt the thing she had been refusing to feel since the first morning she had stood at the prow of the longship and seen a figure on a ridge, and felt a pressure in the air. They will arrive with arguments, she said. Diplomatic language. Carefully constructed concerns about propriety and my well-being and the family's honor. Yes. And you are not going to be moved by any of it. He looked at her with an expression she finally, completely understood.
No.
She thought about what it meant to be seen clearly by someone who had no reason to choose the generous interpretation and had chosen it anyway, over and over, starting from a ridge above a harbor in the snow. She thought about the library and the cloak and Gunnar's startled laugh and Sigrid's careful increments of truth and the fire burning low while she said things she had never said to anyone. She thought about the next 2 weeks and the confrontation to come and the specific, extraordinary challenge of being someone's choice when you had spent your whole life being categorically no one's choice. I am going to need time, she said, to prepare. To be, she paused, finding the right word, ready, for them. How long? 2 weeks. He nodded. Then you have 2 weeks. And then, quietly, as though it was simply a fact he was offering, whatever you need. Whatever will help. She went back to the eastern wing, and she sat with her hands in her lap, and she let herself, for the first time in as long as she could remember, believe it. Chapter 9. The family arrives. They came in their finest furs. Of course they did. Her stepmother had never arrived anywhere unprepared, had never presented herself in any context without first calculating the impression she would make and dressing the calculation accordingly. She stepped off the longship at Nordvik Harbor in a traveling cloak of dark marten with silver trim, moving with the posture of a woman who had practiced arriving in places that were supposed to be impressed by her. Her father came after, gray and tired, in the way he had been gray and tired for the past 10 years, carrying himself with the faint quality of a man who has been making decisions he knew were wrong for long enough that the wrongness has become structural. Astrid came last, luminous and carefully positioned, beautiful in a way that had always been weaponized rather than celebrated, a woman who had learned young that her value is decorative and had become extraordinary at the performance of it. Michelle watched them from the upper walkway as they crossed the harbor district toward the keep. She watched from a distance she had chosen deliberately, high enough to see without being seen, far enough to observe the recalibration that happened when the escort greeted them with northern courtesy and led them toward the main gate. She watched her stepmother's eyes move, quick and professional, across the architecture of the keep, assessing it. She watched her father look at the ground. She wore the wolf fur cloak. The great hall had been arranged with a care that was not ceremonial but strategic. A slack had chosen every detail, the seating positions, the lighting, the placement of his jarls along the walls where their presence communicated the weight of the northern court without requiring them to speak. The fire was high. The table was set with the best northern silver, and at the head of it, a slack Christensen stood with the absolute stillness of a man who has chosen his ground and knows it completely. Michelle stood at his right side. Not behind him, not to the side, not in the position of a visitor or a guest or a temporary resident of uncertain status. Beside him, the positioning was deliberate, chosen by him, and she had agreed to it with the full understanding of what it communicated, which was, without diplomatic ambiguity, that she had not been disposed of. She had been claimed. She watched her stepmother enter the hall, and watched her gaze find them, and watched her expression do the thing it did when something had departed significantly from the plan, a barely visible recalibration, a microscopic adjustment of the performance. Her stepmother began with warmth. Of course she did. Warmth was her primary weapon, and she wielded it with the precision of a surgeon. Warm greeting, warm concern, warm family language, the vocabulary of care deployed to create the impression that everything she said came from love rather than calculation. She addressed Slack with the correct formal greeting, thanked him for his hospitality, expressed her family's gratitude for his grace's patience with what had been, she was sure, a challenging situation. Then she turned to Michelle with an expression of maternal concern so precisely calibrated it would have read as genuine to anyone who had not been its object for 23 years.
"My darling," she said.
"We have been so worried." Michelle looked at her and did not say anything. She did not need to. She had spent 2 weeks preparing for this, and what she had prepared was not a speech or an argument or a list of accusations. She had prepared stillness. The stillness of someone who no longer needs to defend a version of herself, because someone else has already decided what the truth is. Her stepmother spoke for several minutes. The narrative was elegant. Concern for Michelle's well-being, regret for any misunderstanding, a gentle implication that Michelle's time in the North had perhaps been more emotional than she could manage, the offer of Astrid as a more suitable and level-headed representative of the family's good intentions. Slack let her finish. He was very good at waiting. She had come to understand this as one of his most significant skills, the patience to let a thing complete itself, to allow a performance to run its full course so that when he finally spoke it was into silence rather than across an ongoing argument. "I have a question," he said. Her stepmother turned to him with the expression of a woman who is very good at questions. "Did you know," he said, "when you described your stepdaughter's value in the letter you sent me, that she reads the old language?"
A pause.
"She reads your histories," he continued, without urgency, in the tone of a man simply presenting facts. "She identified a navigational error in a rune map my best cartographers had certified as accurate. The error had been present in our records for 60 years. She found it in 3 days." He paused. "She has also renegotiated 2 trade terms with my Jarls in the past 2 weeks, in conversations she initiated herself, in ways that create better conditions for both our peoples than the original agreements did. My senior Jarl, a man who has outlasted 3 kings and trusts no one quickly, considers her counsel reliable." He looked at her stepmother with the expression Michelle had come to think of as his assessment face, not hostile, not warm, simply completely attentive. "I am curious what use you were hoping I would make of her," he said. The hall went very quiet. The fire was the only sound. Her stepmother's expression maintained its form with admirable control, but something had left the room. The momentum of her performance, the sense that she was managing a situation that could be managed. Her father looked up. He looked at Michelle for the first time since they had entered the hall, really looked at her, with the specific quality of attention of a man confronting something he has avoided confronting for a very long time. She met his gaze and held it, and did not help him with what he was feeling. Astrid looked at the fire. "Your daughter," Slack said quietly, and the use of the word rather than stepdaughter was precise and deliberate, and everyone in the room heard the distinction, "will remain in Nordvik. Not as a guest. Not as an emissary." He did not say as what. He did not need to. The positioning, beside him, at his right hand, in his hall, in his colors, had already said it. "This," he said, "is not a negotiation." The fire crackled. The mountains outside pressed against the sky. And Michelle Strom, the dispensable daughter, the plain one, the girl who had been sent away as a thing of no consequence, stood at the right hand of the most powerful man in the North and felt, for the first time in her life, the weight of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Chapter 10. The Ridge, the Choice, the Beginning. They left the next morning. The departure had the texture of a retreat. No drama, no argument, because there was nothing left to argue. The ground had been taken, and both sides knew it. Her stepmother's farewell was silence and a spine held very straight, and the face of a woman converting a loss into a strategy for the next engagement, because she was not the kind of person who accepted permanent defeat. She was the kind of person who reorganized. Her father's departure was different. He stopped at the longship's edge. The harbor was gray and cold, the water the color of pewter, the mountains behind the keep catching the early light in ways that made them look, briefly, warmer than they were. He stopped and turned and looked at Michelle, who had come to the harbor to watch them leave, not out of cruelty, not to observe the victory, but because she felt she owed it to herself to witness the departure fully, to not look away from it. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man whose regret has arrived precisely too late and knows it. She looked back. She did not make it easier for him. She had done that for too long. Made things easier for the people who had made things harder for her, smoothed the discomfort of others at the cost of her own, accommodated and softened and adjusted.
She was done with that practice.
But she also did not look away. She met his eyes and held them and let him see her, actually see her, possibly for the first time. The woman his daughter had become in the absence of his attention. He nodded.
Once.
Small. It was not an apology because he did not have the language for apology. She had known that for years, had stopped waiting for it years before she left. But it was something. An acknowledgement. A registration of the debt. She nodded back. That was all. He turned and stepped onto the longship, and it was enough. Astrid was last. She stopped beside Michelle, and for a moment they simply stood side by side the way they had stood side by side as children. Not close, never close, raised in a household that had arranged them as competitors rather than sisters, and Michelle waited for the diplomatic goodbye, the correct northern farewell, the words of a woman managing an exit. Instead, Astrid touched her hand. Very briefly. The lightest contact, the kind that is over before it fully begins. And she said, low enough that only Michelle could hear it, I asked them not to write that letter. Michelle looked at her. She saw the truth of it in Astrid's face. Not performed, not calculated, not the expression of someone managing a situation. Just true. She had asked them not to. She had not been able to stop them. She had carried that since, in the particular private way of someone who knows they failed to prevent something and has not been able to set it down. I know, Michelle said. And she did know. Now that she was looking at her sister's face with the specific clarity that comes from no longer being afraid, she could see things she had not been able to see from inside the fog of her own accumulated hurt. The things Astrid had tried to do, the small and limited interventions of a person who did not have enough power to change the primary dynamic and had worked within the margins she had. It was not forgiveness. It was not ready to be forgiveness. It was the acknowledgement of a truth that might, in time, become the foundation for something that had never existed between them before. Come back, Michelle said quietly. Sometime. When you choose to, not because they send you. Astrid looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in her face. Then she stepped onto the longship, and the gangway was raised, and the ship began its slow turn into the harbor. Michelle watched it until it was small against the dark water. Then she turned back, toward the keep. He was waiting at the harbor gate, which she had not expected. She had thought he would be in the war room, or the great hall, doing the work of a king who has spent a morning attending to personal matters and must return to institutional ones. But he was at the gate, leaning against the stone with his arms crossed, watching her cross the harbor district with the expression she had come to recognize as his truest one. Not the managed face of public performance, not the careful professional attention of the great hall, but the specific quality of focus he had when he was simply, without strategy, looking at something he was glad to see. She reached him. They fell into step together without discussion, moving up through the lower keep toward the ridge path, the one she had learned in her second week, the path that wound up from the harbor to the high ground where the whole fjord opened out below you and the mountains lined the horizon like a sentence in a language she was still learning to read. The ridge at dusk was extraordinary. The mountains had turned purple with the dying light, the colors moving through amber and rose and finally into that deep impossible violet that the north produced on clear evenings like a thing it was making specifically to be seen. The fjord below was black glass, still as thought. The wind was sharp enough to make her eyes water. They stood together without speaking for a long time. She had learned his silences well enough by now to know the difference between the ones that were waiting and the ones that were simply at rest, and this one was at rest, a man who has resolved something large and is standing inside the resolution, not needing anything further. Then he said, "They offer me your sister as a replacement." She already knew this. Sigrid had told her. She had sat with it, the image of her stepmother presenting Astrid like a corrected trade offer, more suitable, more polished, better suited to the consequences that Michelle had somehow stumbled into, and she had felt many things about it, some of them small and mean-spirited and human, some of them simply tired. "I know," she said. "I told them," he said, "that the North does not take replacements." The wind moved between them. Below, the fjord held its stillness. She could feel the weight of the cloak around her, the specific warmth of it, the warmth she had been wearing every morning for weeks without letting herself think too carefully about what it meant. He turned to face her, and she felt it before she saw it. The shift in the quality of the air, the thing that happened when he stopped managing what he allowed to be visible and simply let the visibility exist. She looked at him, and his face in the last of the evening light was open in a way she had not seen it fully open before. No calculation, no management, no performance of authority or restraint or any of the things a king required himself to perform. He looked like a man standing on the edge of something he had spent a long time approaching and has finally, without drama, arrived at. "I spent 10 years believing that a king without attachment was a king without weakness," he said. His voice was quiet in the wind, but very clear. "And I was correct. I was entirely correct. For 10 years I was completely correct and completely without weakness and completely," he paused. "Alone. In every way that it is possible to be alone while surrounded by people." She did not fill the pause. She had learned that his pauses did not need filling. "I would like to stop being correct," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the ridge above the harbor when she arrived, the figure in the snow haze, the pressure in the air, the thing she had felt before she could see it. She thought about the library and the letter and the cloak and the 2 hours of conversation and the storm and the fire and every small, accumulating moment of being assumed toward instead of away from. She thought about 23 years of being the dispensable one, the plain one, the temporary placeholder, and about what it had cost her and what it had built in the absence of that cost, the library, the texts, the habit of observation, the capacity for attention that came from years of being a person to whom no one paid any. She thought about who she was when someone looked.
"So would I," she said.
It was the simplest sentence she had ever spoken, and the most completely true. The wind moved between them, cold and sharp, and carrying the smell of snow and pine, and the deep clean scent of the fjord. Neither of them retreated from it. When he lifted his hand to her face, careful, deliberate, with the particular quality of movement that belongs to someone who does not do things carelessly with things they have decided to value, she did not step back. She had spent 23 years being sent away, sold short, made invisible by the people who should have known better. She was done accommodating their version of her. She was done living inside the frame they had built. His hand was warm against her cold cheek. She closed her eyes for a moment and simply let herself exist inside the warmth of it, the deliberateness of it, the quality of being held by someone who had chosen to hold rather than being arranged around someone who had no idea she was there. The kiss, when it came, was slow and deliberate and entirely, completely, without reservation. It tasted like snow and wood smoke and the end of a very long exile, and it went on long enough that the last of the purple light left the mountains and the stars began their slow emergence above the fjord, and neither of them noticed, and neither of them cared. When it ended, she did not move away. She rested her forehead against his jaw and felt his arms settle around her, and she breathed in the cold and the wood smoke and the specific warmth of a person who has decided you are worth keeping. Below them, the lights of Nordvik Keep began to appear in its windows, the household going about its evening, the fires being laid, the court settling into its night rhythms, all of it continuing with the indifferent persistence that life had. The mountain held its silence. The fjord held its stillness. "They sent you north to disappear," he said quietly, against her hair. Not a question. A statement. An accounting. "Yes," she said. A pause. His arms tightened slightly, not possessively, not with the urgency of a man afraid of losing something, but with the deliberate pressure of someone making a choice and choosing to make it physically evident. They did not account, he said, for the fact that the North was already watching, and had already decided. She pulled back enough to look at him. His face in the starlight was the most honest face she had ever seen, all scar and structure, and the specific, particular warmth of someone who has been careful with everything he valued and has finally, irrevocably, decided to be careful with this. What had it decided? She asked. He looked at her with an expression she finally, completely, had no need to interpret. That this woman, this quiet, overlooked, impossibly capable woman, was exactly what it had been waiting for. She held his gaze. She did not look away from it. She did not minimize it, did not deflect it, did not manage it into something smaller and safer, and more consistent with a lifetime of being told she was less than this. She received it, fully, completely, without qualification. And the mountains behind them held their peace, and the fjord below held its stillness, and the stars continued their ancient and indifferent turning above the north, and for one suspended, luminous, annihilating moment, and then another, and then another. Neither of them was alone.
If you enjoy watching this story, please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.